Hey Google, take me to Avonlea.
Alright, Avonlea, let's go.
So tonight's mission is to capture the moon, Pleiades, their seven sisters, and Venus, kind of as they all kind of come together. So tonight they're all really close to one another. And so my hope is that as they come close to the horizon tonight, around midnight, I'm going to be in a good position to capture them just as they kind of come right above that horizon. So I've got myself a kind of tree scoped out near Avonlea, Saskatchewan, and that's where we're headed right now to try and get that conjunction as it comes down to the horizon. So let's go. I made it to our spot, so technically speaking, if everything works out according to Planet, is the app I was using, that the azimuth angle that this particular kind of conjunction sets at is 302 degrees. So basically this camera is pointing straight 302 degrees so that when this moves into position, we're going to be looking pretty nice. So this position kind of happens around 11:40 p.m. and right now we're just at about 10 o'clock. So we're pretty early still. I don't necessarily want to start doing my sky exposures right now. I kind of want to get a little more realistic. So I'm going to start shooting my sky exposures probably around 10:30, 10:45 to give myself about an hour of integration so I can bring out a little bit more detail in the Pleiades. Hopefully get some of those blues. We'll kind of have to see what happens when we start shooting the sky. That moon and Venus are pretty bright, so they might kind of compete with the Pleiades for a bit of that attention. So we'll see what happens, but for now, foreground exposures are going, and we'll kind of set up the sky right away. Okay, tracker's on. We are tracking Pleiades, moon, Venus down, and so we've got about an hour, I think, until it sets into the exact position I need it to. I've taken a couple of test exposures, and the moon is definitely blown out with the exposure I have. I've even dialed it back. I'm at a minute, f4, ISO 800, and even with that exposure, I'm still blowing on the moon a bit. Venus is having its own kind of flaring issues as well, so there's going to be a few exposures that make this up. Right now I'm taking 36 photos at a minute to try and get a bit of Pleiades detail. The Pleiades is a really beautiful star cluster. If you're taking a longer exposure, say 2 minutes like this one, there is a lot of beautiful color in there. You're not going to see a photo like that here. It's just not going to happen. The moon is too bright. It's washing out that detail. That said, I did zoom in on some of that, and there is a little bit there to pull out, so that's kind of why I'm taking these exposures, just for the Pleiades, to try and get at that detail, that nebulosity that's in there. And then my hope is once those 36 exposures are over, I'm about halfway through right now. Well, a little less than halfway. I've only started. I'm going to basically take a few exposures for the moon, probably 8 to 10 for both the dark side and the bright side of the moon, to make sure that nothing is really blown out. And then I'm going to take another kind of couple photos for Venus to make sure that that flaring issue is gone. So there's quite a few exposures that are going to make this up. But the idea is that I am not touching tripod location, tracker's all just going to stay on, and it's just me changing my exposure so that once this glides into position, I should have it just exactly where I want it. Now, I only ended up using 24 of those 36 exposures for the Pleiades. A few of them had some periodic error, so basically the gear is slipping on the tracker, causing a bit of trailing, and a bit of breeze blew up once in a while, so there's some some star bloat going on, so some of the stars kind of got large from shaking back and forth. So 12 of them were basically trash, and 24 I kept, and I stacked them all, and this is kind of what came out. So if I zoom in on a single exposure, You can see nice pinpoint stars, and the Pleiades, we do have some nice detail here. Unfortunately, the moon moves at a different pace than the rest of the night sky. So if I'm zooming in on my moon here, you can see it's quite soft. It's not doesn't have any hard edges. And once you stack a whole bunch of exposures together, you can see here we have nice clean detail on the Pleiades. Everything is nice and sharp. But if I go to the moon, it's just a streaky, blurry mess. So ultimately, that's why I took separate moon exposures. I did take the 20 that I said I would take, but I actually ended up using one of them. Once I stacked all those moon exposures, it just didn't look right. As the night progressed, there was some high altitude cloud that started moving in and kind of started covering the moon up and Venus, and so had a bit of an issue when I went to stack. And so this is ultimately what it ended up looking like. This is one exposure of the moon. So I have, if I zoom in, you can see everything is nice and sharp. This is blown out, and I actually didn't end up blending anything back in there. It's just a blown out piece of moon because it looked a bit too HDR once I put the exposure for the highlights in the moon back in. So ultimately I ended up using just one of these exposures and just blended in the clouds and then left the detail for the Pleiades out of this exposure. So the good part about that was I didn't actually have to erase this large kind of moon. I can just basically cover over it with this, so everything stays accurate to size. So everything is basically shot at 175 millimeters. And as the night wore on, you can see this is kind of one of my last exposures. So it kind of gave me, where everything was located generally. So the Pleiades is just over top of the tree, and then we have Venus to the far right and the moon to the far left. So this is the tree, and then earlier in the night, obviously, I took separate exposures for the tree. And thankfully, there was no breeze at all then, so these branches, if I zoom in on them, really nice and crispy. This is a single image. I did take 16 images for the foreground. I used 12 of them. Again, there was some movement in some of the tree branches in 4 of them, so I used 12, stacked them together to give myself a really clean foreground file. So in these deepscapes, there's always some element of artistry and composite to it. You're never going to get a one-to-one single exposure just because the focal lengths we're using, you just can't get a shutter speed that long to where you can see anything in either the sky or the foreground. You're only at 2 or 3 seconds, so you're not going to get a single exposure. So that said, there's always going to be some blending that happens in here because we're taking 30 minutes to an hour long of sky exposures. That foreground becomes a completely blurry mess. So we have to take separate foregrounds and impose those onto our sky. So immediately you have those that are going to call fake or foul on this image. It's not going to be a true representation of what's there in some people's minds. And I have no problems with that. There is, in the nightscape community, terms called blending that maybe make it more scientifically accurate, and that's what I would call this. But in the end of the day, you are combining exposures, so it is a composite. That said, the reason I do this is not because I'm trying to be scientifically accurate to anything. I'm trying to relay to you, the viewer, what it feels like to be under the night sky. It's complete. It's vast, it's huge, it's completely majestic, and it makes me feel completely insignificant. And so when I'm seeing these things happen, watching the Pleiades set beside the moon, immediate my impression is, man, the Pleiades are huge. They're bigger than the moon is. And it makes me feel tiny because the moon's pretty big. And so when that's the reason for these pictures, is I'm trying to relay the emotion that I feel, that insignificance and that the awe and the majesty of the heavens is just inspiring to me. And so I hope that comes across in these images, and that's why I love doing these deepscapes so much. But I do encourage you, if you want to do these, to try and make them as scientifically accurate as possible. There are a ton of planning tools available to you that make this fairly easy. It does take quite a bit of time to try and figure out exactly where to go and where to stand at the right time. But once you know that information, these are fairly easy to do. You do need a tracker, so I do encourage you, if you do have one, there's no reason not to try this at least. You may as well. It's not going to hurt, and you may find, hey, it's not for me, but there's nothing quite like it. So these deepscapes, I hope they start catching on, and without further ado, I'm going to throw the one I got up here. I hope you guys enjoy it. And that's it for this video, guys. I really hope you found it helpful, inspiring, and if you did, I appreciate, give me a thumbs up on this and subscribe if you want to see more like it. And as always, I wish you clear skies. Cheers, guys.